Welcome. This is Two Sessions Spotlight. I'm Bo Wen. Today, our guest is Professor Xie Tao. Professor Xie is the dean of the School of International Relations and Diplomacy at Beijing Foreign Studies University. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
So we're talking about Two Sessions today. Two Sessions is a big annual event in China's political calendar. Two Sessions are the National People's Congress, which is China's top legislature, and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which is China's political advisory body. Usually, Two Sessions are held at the beginning of March every year, but this year, due to the COVID-19 outbreak, both meetings have been postponed to this week. Professor, we are talking about the Two Sessions, and my first question would be, the People's Congress system is the fundamental political system of the People's Republic of China. So as an expert on China and the U.S. relations, can you provide any must-know knowledge so that our overseas audience can better understand what the Two Sessions are?
Good. Let me start off by saying that China's National People's Congress is the highest lawmaking body in China. And in that sense, China's NPC, for short, National People's Congress, is very much like the U.S. Congress. It's a lawmaking body. But it's different from the U.S. Congress in many aspects. And so I just say one thing at the moment. It has close to 3,000 members. And they come to Beijing every year. That's called the one session, right? Normally, each session is held in early March of every year. But we all know because of COVID-19, this year's session has been postponed until today. Yeah. And then, because we often say there are two sessions, what is the other session? The other session is called the session of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. Now, CPPCC, in short, what does this mean? It's actually an organization or institution that actively seeks members, not just from the Communist Party, but also members who are not the Communist Party, but they are brought into the Chinese government policy-making decision. So it's a multi-party cooperation and consultation mechanism. You can say that this is a kind of unique around the world. You have the ruling party, which is the Communist Party of China, that actively seeks out cooperation and consultation from the other political parties. So that's why we talk about the two sessions. Again, let me summarize. The two sessions refer to the session of the National People's Congress of China and the session of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference.
Yeah, so just now you mentioned about the U.S. Congress. So can I ask, what's the differences between, in China we have the National People's Congress, but in the U.S. there is the U.S. Congress, and in the U.K. there is the U.K. Parliament. Can you make a brief comparison?
Yes, yeah, it's a very important question. I think for many observers outside China, they often get confused. How do we understand the Chinese political system? So let's start with China's highest lawmaking body, the National People's Congress. Like I just said, that it has over close to 3,000 members, delegates. We call them delegates.
Right.
They are selected on a 5-yearly basis. That means delegates, each Congress comes to serves a term of 5 years. But the members or delegates come to Beijing each year. So that's called the annual session, right? The first.
Right.
Second, in China, there's only one chamber of the lawmaking body. Whereas in the United States, you have the lower chamber, which is called the House of Representatives. And then you have the upper chamber called the Senate. You mentioned the UK Parliament. The UK Parliament also, we call this a bicameral structure. It has a House of Lords as well as a House of the Commons.
Right.
Okay. But our legislative system, we call that in English, political science jargon, called unicameral, not bicameral. Okay. The first major difference. Second is that our delegates are not serving their term as a full-time job. In other words, being a member of the National People's Congress is not a full-time job. So after the two sessions are over, or the session of the NPC is over, delegates would return to where they come from. They would go back to their normal job. Whereas in the U.S. system, if you are a member of the Congress, the House or the Senate, that's your full-time job. you get paid, and you stayed in Washington, right? You
Right.
rent an apartment.
Yeah.
You bring your wife and the kids over to Washington, D.C. So that's another major difference.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's
A
a huge one.
third difference is that in the Chinese system, let me put it this way, in the Chinese system, members of the National People's Congress, because there are so many of them, okay, and so there's no way you would have all of them to come together and to deliberate each and every bill or law. So what happens is that we have a standing committee of the National People's Congress, and which has about 180 members. And so the day-to-day, daily job of lawmaking, deliberating, going through these bills, these technical jobs are actually handled by this very important standing committee of the National People's Congress. So I hope I give you a kind of
That's
a
a very
clear
detailed
picture
explanation.
of the differences.
Right. And also, this year marks the end of China's current 5-year development plan. I think that's also a very huge topic, because making 5-year development plans has ensured consistency in China's policy making and has delivered tangible results. So what, in your view, what kind of role does this 5-year plan or national agenda play in the development of the economy in China?
So yes, this year marks the beginning, actually, of the 14th five-year plan. Oh, excuse me, the end of the 13th five-year plan and the planning for the next, that is a 14th five-year plan, right?
Right.
This is a Chinese economic tradition. I say economic because this shows that the Chinese government, the state, is very actively involved in planning China's macro economy. So which sector we're going to develop, which area we're going to invest a lot, and which kind of industries we're going to promote, etc. So you can call this is called a state planning. And many people outside China don't like the word planning, central planning. And that means the state is playing a predominant role. Well, in one sense, they are maybe right, because this is indeed the state is playing a leading role. But on the other hand, if you have a 5-year plan, that will gives you time to think ahead, to have kind of a vision, okay? And you do not get distracted by this perennial electoral pressure, like members of Congress. They have to face election and re-election every 2 years. Presidents, they face election every 4 years, right? So having this kind of 5-year plan allows, actually I would say forces Chinese leaders, policymakers to think ahead. Okay, what the future will be like? Emerging industries, emerging economic challenges, what kind of resources we need, and what kind of demands that the Chinese people would have on the Chinese government. So in general, I would think, this is kind of a competitive advantage of the Chinese political system compared with its Western counterparts.
Right. Also, we know that the government report has been made available to the public today. And there is some very interesting observation I made, which is no economic growth targets are set for 2020. But there are measures that are rolled out by the Chinese government to secure employment, secure economic growth. I want to ask your take on that.
Right, because there's a lot of expectation about the Premier's government report, which was released this morning, right? Because you all know that this global pandemic has had, I would say, a devastating impact on almost every country around the world. The major economies in the West, the United States and the UK, Germany, China itself, and so nobody really can tell when the whole global economy would recover. And so that's why you mentioned this word employment. The Chinese government's #1 priority right now across the government, all decision-making area, is to ensure that we would have jobs for most people. Second, given so much uncertainty surrounding global economic recovery, it's nearly impossible, I would say, to set a goal for China's economic growth for 2020. Okay, I got notice from the government's report that last year we actually had a very, very extraordinary growth rate, it's a 6.3 percentage point, right?
Right.
This is far, far better than most other countries around the world. But look at this year, I think no government around the world ever would want to put out a forecast for its own economy. There's just so much uncertainty.
And also, some people in the West say the two sessions this year sends a signal to the world that China has got, we've mentioned this before, China has got the epidemic under control. I want to ask your opinion on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the two sessions means you're talking about close to 6,000 people traveling over to Beijing from different parts of China. And because of the pandemic, some areas in China are still under very, very strict regulations. There's bans or restrictions on travel, right? So when you have the two sessions in Beijing, that's a very clear, unmistakable message that most parts of China now are under control. And so that these delegates, remember many of these delegates are local government leaders. And so they can get away, at least for 7 days, to come over to Beijing and to deliberate the major policies ahead for 2021 and the 14th five-year plan. So you're right. By having these two sessions, we are telling the world that China has achieved a decisive battle against COVID-19.
And also, some foreign journalists cannot attend the meeting because of the outbreak. However, the two sessions are still attracting more attention than ever among other countries. I want to ask, what kind of image do you think that China has projected to the world through the two sessions?
Well, the two sessions every year, I would say, it projects several images. One is that even though these delegates are not selected in the Western-style competitive elections, but they are nevertheless broadly representative of the Chinese people. So you do not have to be competitively elected to be representative of people. And so in political science, we often say there are two types of representation, symbolic and substantive. And many people care more about what happens rather than who gets elected into the office, right? So by having these two sessions, we're showing to the world that we have a very special system of representation. For this year's two sessions, if you have them right now, like I said just now, it's a message that Chinese people, they have the resolve and they have the persistence and the will to fight against COVID-19, and they have largely prevailed. And they have set an example for the rest of the world. You see, many other countries are still deep in trouble. They are trying to get the situation under control. Whereas now we are having several thousand, close to 10,000 people traveling over to the capital of China, right? And so I think all these are kind of an uplifting message. It gives Chinese people, at least here, a very heavy dose of optimism looking ahead. Yes, we have had a very bad first part of 2020. But looking ahead, we probably are going to make up for what was lost in the early part of 2020.
We're standing back on our
Yes, yes.
I think I want to talk more about local government's response on the pandemic. We have many lessons to learn from fighting against the COVID-19 outbreak. And Chinese President Xi Jinping has also urged efforts to improve the public health system. So how do you think the two sessions can help achieve that goal?
Well, I read the news and I found there's already, yesterday evening, the spokesperson for the National People's Congress, the first session, he already mentioned that there are up to 30 laws about public health that would either be updated or some of them would be newly enacted. This is a major crisis for China, and this is a major public health crisis for the world too. So it's a challenge. I think every government, when facing a crisis like this, it takes time to learn, to get used to this, to learn how to fight against it, how to control it, how to develop the vaccine. And so in that sense, I think you are absolutely right. This is a learning process for Chinese government. And I think Chinese government has done a very good job, far better than many other governments around the world. And second, the Chinese government really sends out a kind of projects its own image as like it's trying each and every effort to save each and every life. And so our healthcare system, the values that we put into human lives are kind of different from the Western political culture. And so in that sense, I would say we set an example, for many countries around the world to follow. Okay.
And also, I heard that there is a bill that the NBC has deliberated on, which is to strengthen national security in Hong Kong. I want to ask, what does this mean for Hong Kong SAR?
Hong Kong returned to China in 1997. And so Deng Xiaoping, the former preeminent leader, promised that we would practice one country, two systems. However, one country, two systems does not mean one country, two sovereignties. What happened last year, as most people outside China knew, is chaos, violence. And this has brought devastating impact to Hong Kong, one of the major commercial financial centers in the world, not just in East Asia. And why this happened? I think most people would agree it's because some local politicians, as well as some outside forces, they try to whip up this kind of hostile sentiments against the central government here. And unfortunately, people who suffered the most from the chaos, instability, are Hong Kong people themselves. And I would say that's why it's so imperative that the central government here, especially the National People's Congress, because it's the highest lawmaking body, to pass laws to make sure that the national security of Hong Kong is stabilized and safeguarded. Hong Kong is an integral part of China. There's no question about that. And so any effort to split it, to destabilize it, would not be tolerated by the Chinese government here, and nor will it be tolerated by the Chinese people. So I think this law has been probably long overdue, and in many people's eyes, the central government should have adopted a more aggressive measure to crack down on violence in Hong Kong, to restore its own prosperity and stability. So I think this probably would cause some controversy in outside China, as you can imagine. But I think this is an overwhelmingly welcome step by the central government.
Thank you, Professor, for providing insights into all these topics. And I'm sure everyone, after watching this episode, will have a better understanding of what the two sessions are. So this is Two Sessions Spotlight. I'm your host, Bo Wen. Until next time.